Okay, I'm Daniel Friend. I am a freelance editor. I've been at the editing booth a little bit this convention. I don't know if I'll be back there at all, but you can certainly come and talk to me after the panel. I'll get you my card and we can talk about editing stuff. And one of the biggest jobs that I have as an editor is as a fact checker and as someone who goes and just does enough research to make sure that authors aren't talking out of their butts and making crazy claims in their writing. And that's one of those things that I do. I'm also very active politically, and so populism is something that I pay attention to quite a bit. I have self-published a book on politics that you have probably a little card for in your swag bags. It's called Why More Mormons Should Be Democrats. Spoiler, I'm a Democrat. Anyway, that's enough about why I'm here.
I'm Christopher Baxter. I'm also a freelance editor with everything that implies. Thanks. That's handy. And I'm an author, and I have a degree in Russian history and language, which it's impossible to get without learning a fair little deal about populism, rebellions, and the like. So that's why I am here.
Cool. My name is Alicia McIntire, and I have a master's in public policy. I worked as an auditor for the state of South Carolina, and now I work as a data analyst for Utah. And I took a couple classes on populism from like the guy that literally wrote the book about it. Wrote the book about Hugo Chavez, and so it's super interesting. So first off, I guess we should define populism, because there are a lot of different ways people think about it. It's not just rebellion, right? Like there's more to it.
Well, most of the time, populism it goes through the regular electoral channels, the regular political path. Yeah, the regular political process.
Yeah. So Kirk Hawkins defined it as an uprising from the bottom, going through regular political channels or not, but that also has a really strong Manichaean discourse. So really good versus evil. Let's talk about some examples of that.
The basic example is always it's the people versus the rich or the royalty or the educated or elite. The people,
elites.
The evil elite of some kind, and that can be anything from the aristocracy in the French Revolution to the people that Hugo Chavez replaced, the title of which escapes me, to intellectuals and academics who don't care about what the common people have to care about.
Career politicians.
Yes,
seem out of touch with the common man.
Yeah. Basically, any smaller yet more influential group at the top of society can become the target of everybody else at the bottom who feels they're being ignored when you have the right leader and the right other circumstances for populist movements to take root.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't even have to be people in that society, right? Like, using the example of Chavez, for him it was all America is hedonist and terrible, and so it was sort of people who were at the top of the world class structure, not even as much.
Yeah, and with the Soviet Union, it was a lot of it was Ukraine and Belarus and all the other Eastern Bloc countries that were not Russia saying we are being put down by Russia. Like, Russia is controlling us. We do not have the advantages that the Russians have. So it was an entire nation of people they are all doing this to us, and we want to change that.
So we all like to think of ourselves as rational thinkers, right? But there's so much emotion in populism. How do people get swept up in that? What are some either the tactics that populist leaders might use, or how do regular people?
Very often, you have a very charismatic leader who understands, or at least can project that he understands the common people, that I understand you, I know what you're going through, I am giving voice to all of your concerns and frustrations, and some of those concerns and frustrations are very legitimate problems. But finally, someone with some power is listening to the common people, and they are going to change something. And if we go and vote for them and support them and rally in the streets or whatever the leader is calling them to do for their action, that we can actually get the change that we want. Hugo Chavez is, or was possibly, one of the biggest masters of this in the history of the world. He was phenomenal at getting everyone to not only love him, but believe that he was on their side and that he alone out of everyone would be able to fix the problems and would take their problems up to the highest levels and make things better. And people believed it for his entire life. He was that good at maintaining this. Despite everything that happened, Venezuela went through recessions, Venezuela had problems of all kinds, but yet Hugo Chavez kept getting reelected. And we have no reason to think that that's even wrong. He legitimately won the elections as far as we can tell because people believed him and supported him. And so that charismatic leader who gives voice to the people who feel they have been voiceless, who remembers the people who feel they have been forgotten, that kind of leader is the charismatic populist leader that tends to run these types of movements. And if that sounds familiar to you,
It never stops. It's always going.
Think about that.
Populism tends to rise where there is instability. If there's economic instability, anything that people are afraid of, where something in their life is shaky and they don't think they have the power to change that, they want someone above them. They unite together to, it's like, we're going to have a government that will fix these things for us. And so any sort of economic stability can easily give rise to populist movements, and they rise left and right. I mean,
especially where you have economic instability, where an elite class is benefiting at the expense of everyone else,
can be made to appear to be benefiting. Yeah,
yes,
it's like, and that can happen. And so, like in Russia, which most of my examples I'll be pulling from, it's like in the early 1900s, it was the monarchy, it was the Tsar. And you had a lot of people who had been freed. They were no longer slaves. They were no longer serfs. They were emancipated, but there were still so many restrictions on what they could do, and they were dying. They could not afford the basic necessities of life, and it led to repeated rebellions until they finally, after several decades, just completely overthrew the monarchy and put in a new government. But it was that fear of I'm not managing to take care of myself. I'm putting everything I can into this, and it's not paying off, and I don't know what else to do. That fear is kind of one of the cores of what gives rise to populist movements, because it's not an unreasonable fear. It's the basic core of how am I going to continue meeting the basic necessities of life.
And I think that's why populism can enfold so many people at once. When we're looking at this, we have to understand that most people are rational when it comes to their own needs, and that if a lot of people feel that those needs aren't getting met, then someone who can promise to meet those needs suddenly has a lot of power, even if a lot of the other stuff that they say is verifiably false or completely to one side of the political spectrum or the other, and is really extreme. If they're going to fix the thing that is the most important fear that a lot of people have, and it can even be a fear that's, whether that fear is found or not, if it's real to those people and somebody's going to promise to fix it, they're willing to go with a lot of other stuff to make sure that one fear is assuaged.
Mussolini made the trains run on time. And if someone's promising to bring order, if they're promising, if you have one thing you want and it's this core fear of yours, and there's only one person promising to do anything about it, even if they seem crazy, they still seem like your best shot.
And it's interesting, Mussolini made the trains run on time. Like, it's interesting to see how a lot of these populist movements do something. They do what their constituents want. They fulfill the campaign promise, if you will, that assuages that fear. And they work very, very hard to do that. Now, that thing may or may not be good objectively, or good for other people in the country, or good for other people around that country, but that one thing, they will work very, very hard to make sure that that fear is getting assuaged. And sometimes those measures are effective and they actually work, and sometimes they're not. But when it comes down to it, the effectiveness of the measure is less important than the fact that the fear is being soothed. People remember how you feel, or how somebody makes you feel, much more than they remember what somebody did. And that is one of the interesting quirks of humankind.
Yeah, I think Chavez is a great example of that as well, because he promised more independence and that kind of thing. And so he does things like makes gas super cheap for everyone, and which is great, right? Because especially if you're poor, you spend a lot of your expendable income on commodities like that, like basic commodities. But it had all these other ripple effects, like where people were, in some instances, using like gas instead of water for stuff, because gas is all of a sudden cheaper than water. And yeah, but people still really loved him. And he was really good at firing up a crowd.
It is amazing how that love can linger for a long time. Stalin was in power for decades. And even though he was horrible, he was like, he's one of the rare figures in history of whom his opponents' propaganda about him, the American propaganda about how horrible he was, actually falls short of reality. And he was heinous, he was horrible, but he was a hero to the people who were still alive, because they were still alive. Because for Russians, especially in the first half of the 20th century, whether or not you would live to see the end of this year or month or week was a constant concern, and Stalin made them feel safe. He made sure their bellies were full. He made sure that the people who he wanted to have rights had what they wanted, and so they loved him, they adored him. And it wasn't until he finally passed away that hold on the Soviet Union began to tremble and began to fall apart. But yeah, he kept that up for a long time, well past the beginnings of the populist movement that gave him and Lenin and others like them the power that they had.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to see how long that can last. And sometimes it lasts a long time, and it takes years and decades for that image and that power to crumble. And sometimes it takes a lot less time, and that depends on the circumstances of the nation and on the next leader of that nation. It'll be really interesting to watch and see what happens to Venezuela in the next several years, because Nicolás Maduro, which is Chavez's successor, does not have the personal charisma of Hugo Chavez. He has nowhere near that much personal charisma, and he's gone very quickly from the anointed heir to somebody that most people hate. And it'll be really interesting to see if the memory of Chavez and how Chavez made Venezuelans feel is able to sustain Nicolás Maduro's government for much longer. We'll see. We don't know yet what's going to happen with that, but it would not be surprising if Maduro goes away. But the legacy of Chavez still remains.
And another, and I'm sorry, we're just, if you want us to go a different way, you let us know.
No, you're kind of going where I was already going to ask a question,
right.
because one of the things I was thinking of is that Russia is a really interesting example of a populist movement that took off, had this charismatic leader, but then the regime sort of transitioned from charismatic leader to like bureaucratic authoritarianism, and like kept going.
Yeah. Well, and where I was going to go is that what could very well happen there is just another populist movement. Anytime the people are discontented, there can be these sort of populist movements. And Russia just has a repeated history of that over and over and over again. The populist movements that led to the eventual rebellion, that led to the next rebellion, that led to the overthrow of the Tsar. And then we had the Soviet Union held really tight because Lenin and Stalin had the personality and the ruthlessness to hold on to that, and then started to tremble, but still kept that bureaucracy going for decades. But then it finally fell to yet another populist movement. There were more populist movements that are like, we are prisoners in our own country. We want to interact with other countries, with the West. We don't want this anymore. To bring the wall down. and that fell, and Yeltsin rode into power on that. And Yeltsin was the hero of the people. He was the true successor. He was like, now we're going to have democracy. When really it was actually Gorbachev that did most of that. But then Yeltsin could not hold on to it.
Well, he was sort of like everyone's drunk uncle.
Oh yeah, he was not equipped to lead a country. He was not equipped to, but he managed to get at the forefront of that populist movement, and he managed to ride that into a position of power that he couldn't hold on to, and so things started to fall apart again. There was more discontent, and there was more populist movements that gave rise to Putin's reign. And Putin's not going anywhere for a long time because he's got the personality to hold on to that.
And he has the support of the people.
And he does.
The Russian people legitimately love Putin because what happened after Yeltsin, and again, correct me if I'm wrong because you know more about this than I do, but that people felt like, oh, we've lost something. That we've lost something essential to being Russian with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. We've lost so many Russians to other countries. And Putin says, I'm going to get them back. And not only that, but now he's done a lot of that by invading the eastern Ukraine and annexing Crimea and standing up to the West. He is actually going and doing the things that make Russians feel proud to be Russian again.
Well, and more than that too, he did, when he took over, the economy was faltering. They had introduced a new monetary system after the fall of the Soviet Union, and that one fell apart in about 5 years. And their money was absolutely worthless. People had money in the banks that they'd been saving up that was just gone, immediately gone. They had money stashed at home that was worthless, and they introduced a completely new monetary system again. And Putin took over, and he did things with that economy that would make you believe in witchcraft. Like he turned things around overnight. It is astonishing how effective he was, and so people love him. There's plenty of people that know that he's a horrible guy. He's actually basically a living Bond villain, but he has done right by them. And that's their main concern, because Russians have an amazing sense of community identity. The communism didn't create that. It rose in Russia there because they had that. And
it's interesting, when you have a populist leader, especially if there's democratic elections going on of any sort, the only people that leader has to please are the people who vote for him. And as long as he has enough people that vote for him that he can keep getting reelected, nobody else matters. And that can be just, oh, your policies get ignored, you're still around, or it can be, oh, you're going to be shot and executed and put into camps and who knows what else. But I mean, when we look at populism, we have to remember that Hitler was a populist.
in many ways.
Hitler was possibly the most successful populist transitioning to authoritarianism that the world has ever seen. Germany was in a horrible place after the end of the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles that ended that war put Germany in a very unfair position economically, where they had to pay war reparations to the Allies for years. It devastated the German economy. The politicians in Germany after that time were very weak men who were not able to make the German people feel safe or that they mattered or even protected. And the German people had been humiliated in that defeat in World War I. It was no longer that you could be proud to be German, because you were getting your heel, they were getting the boot heel of the West grinding on your face all the time. And then Hitler comes and says, I am going to make Germany great again. And that is his slogan. I can't make that up. That is his actual slogan. And
it's the same sort of thing that Putin said.
Yeah, and then they did it. At least they did it so that their constituents, the people that voted for them, felt like it was happening. And Hitler went and he mobilized the military. He spent a whole lot of money building up Germany's military to its former greatness.
And all the industry that implies behind it.
Exactly. And he made it so that, and he focused on what it meant to be German in his mind. And he did something very important that we haven't talked about yet, and that's he had a scapegoat. In the case of Germany, it was the Jews. And he eventually expanded that to gypsies and homosexuals and a few other non-wanted groups. But he had a scapegoat. And he said, everything that is wrong with our country is the fault of this minority. And if we get rid of them, all of our problems will be solved. And that is why you have concentration camps in World War II.
Yeah, which is an interest, because the scapegoat in this case was not the upper elites. I mean, in a sense it was. The
Jews were
Jewish
richer
people
in
at
general.
the time were depicted as as being so much wealthier, as being money grubbing, as all these horrible stereotypes. And so in a lot of ways they were depicted as, and that is one of those where it's like they weren't necessarily, the vast majority of them were not necessarily in those positions, were not the elites that they were portrayed as, but all he needed was the ability to make people believe that's what they were. And you've got an enemy that the populist movement can unite against.
And then you have Kristallnacht, where the German people just rose up as one to have this horrible pogrom against the Jews, smashing storefronts and burning and looting and doing horrible things to their neighbors who they had lived next to for years, who they had fought with, or they had fought side by side with in World War I. I mean, the Jews were regular Germans for the most part, but because they had that perception of being the snobby, elitist other, they were foreign, they were not truly German, they were a different race somehow, they looked different. There were, and you can look at the propaganda and see the caricatures that Nazi Germany put out about the Jews and making them look so different, and they have these different beliefs. They rejected Christ. They did all of these things that were so bad, and these are based on little kernels of truth that have then been exaggerated into hyperbole. And so it brought forth all of the very worst things that people had ever said about this minority, and then made them the gospel fact for all of them. And that's how Hitler did the Holocaust.
It's interesting that you mentioned their otherness and the, make Germany great again, because up until 70 years before that, Germany was not actually one country. German unification happened in the 1880s, 1870s. It had actually
1851.
1851. Okay, it was actually quite recent. Until not very long
there were still
before
living
that
people
time
who remembered that there had not been a church.
Right.
Yeah.
There were people who had grown up at that point in disunified Germany, and so it's interesting to see how quickly people rallied around a common.
And it's also interesting that the first thing that Hitler did was very similar to what Putin's doing now, was that the first place that Hitler went after was Austria, and he annexed Austria because there were German-speaking, ethnically German people in Austria. In fact, that's what Austria is. And he annexed that first. The second place they went after was this place called the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia that had German-speaking ethnic Germans there. And he ended up grabbing all of Czechoslovakia on the pretense of just the Sudetenland, and the West let him have it because they didn't want to have another world war. But that's what he went for first, was I am protecting the ethnic Germans. Just like Putin is saying now, I am protecting the ethnic Russians and trying to get them all under the one tent. And then he went for the piece of Poland that had Germans too.
And why that works often is because, if you when Putin took Crimea, there are a lot of people that they had an election there to see if the people approve of this, and it was overwhelmingly in favor of being annexed by Russia, and that is not necessarily fake. Ukraine is basically divided down the middle. If you're in Western Ukraine, people hate Russia. The Russians are the people that controlled us for so long. We've been mistreated by them. Projecting that as the Russian people as large is not necessarily true, but having that attitude towards the former Soviet government is definitely justified. If you go to Eastern Russia and Eastern Ukraine and you ask them, what do you think of Russians? They'll say, well, I am Russian. The vast majority of the people are just, well, I'm Russian.
Yeah, well,
I grew up in the Soviet Union. I've always been Russian. I speak Russian.
Well, didn't that happen because one of Stalin's things was to send people out to colonize these places?
Yeah. There's whole lot of reasons why that is the way it is. But what matters to those people now is this is who I am. I'm not really concerned with how it came to be that I am this. And when Russians come knocking, there's the vast majority of the people that are going to go, well, yeah, I'm Russian.
Well, it's an interesting thing even with America that, most of us don't care if we're Scottish or English or Irish or German or French descent, or we're just Americans. Mm-hmm. And a lot of those things don't matter anymore. They used to matter back when say the Italians first came over. If you were an Italian, that was a separate, distinct thing. But nowadays, we don't care so much about that particular type of thing.
Well, or that we've just transitioned to different groups in a lot of ways. But
yeah, that's true.
On a more bleak look at that, but
Curiosity, I did Snopes it. Make Germany Great Again was not a campaign slogan.
I'm sorry about that.
I was curious
That
because
Oh, yeah, that's-
but the mentality of let's make Germany a great nation definitely
But it's
was.
definitely
Yes.
the
But
sort
it
of
wasn't
attitude
actually a
that's-
campaign
yeah.
slogan.
I
got really
sit
curious
corrected
how-
here.
That would be about the most hilariously misstep ever by anybody's president.
We'd already
Yeah.
know. We'd all already know about it from Facebook if it was
Yeah,
the case.
yeah, you're right. It wasn't the slogan. It was the idea.
But the idea was
was
definitely,
definitely there.
Yeah. The other thing is, with you mentioning Crimea with the voting, Hitler actually did do that with when they annexed. They actually sent, before they ever even started, they had people moving there, becoming voters, and then that way when they voted, oh yeah, we want to be annexed by Germany, because they'd sent a large force of immigrants over like 5 years previously. It was
And that's, if you've got
Winston
someone
Churchill talked
charismatic
about it.
and savvy enough, populism is so oft repeated and so familiar a thing that we've seen so many times that it's quite manipulatable. That's part of why you get so many of these charismatic leaders up at the front, is because they know history and they're determined to repeat history to their advantage in a lot of cases.
Yes.
So, do you think that most of the time a populist movement creates sort of the leader, or the charismatic leader helps create the populist?
It's a man in a moment converging in just the right circumstance.
Yeah.
Almost always.
I can give an example of one without that. In Russia, part of the reason they had so many rebellions leading up to the final overthrow of the Tsardom in 1917 is because they failed to find that leader over and over again. You had the major Russian rebellion of 1905. There were a lot of really unhappy former serfs who were under some really awful conditions. They were technically freed and they technically owned their land, but they owned it as a group. Like they say, okay, these group of serfs that used to belong to this lord, they now own all that land together, but you didn't individually own the plot you were sitting on, so you couldn't sell it, you couldn't mortgage it. It was basically useless to you except to grow food, and it was insufficient for that. And so you had a lot of people that were quite genuinely justified in being discontent, and it started giving rise to these populist movements and to even active rebellion in 1905, but it collapsed because the Tsardom came down hard on it, and there was no one that they really solidly united behind until they finally found Lenin and Trotsky in 1917. And even then, it was a mess of competing movements and competing things where it was back and forth. 1917 was actually 2 major rebellions with all sorts of back and forth about it. None of this is ever clean. But you can stand back and look at it from a distance and see patterns that repeat over and over again.
Yeah, it's really that like the situation gets primed often